Good morning, and I'm online with Gary Johns, who presented to the Australians for Science and Freedom conference 2 or 3 weeks ago in Sydney, which I was also present at. Gary spoke on the panel on Indigenous affairs and made some really profound and insightful contributions to that panel. I also shared a copy of my book, The Relentless War on Masculinity, with Gary, and he generously read it and provided some feedback. And I set this up so that we can have a conversation about some of these issues. Just to sort of set the scene, Gary, in the book, I propose a thesis around the Anglo countries having moved from androcentrism 1 to 2 centuries ago to a period of equality of legal rights and education and social status during the 1980s, and then moving through cultural gynocentrism into institutional gynocentrism, which I characterize as a state where there's a strong preference for funding, for programs, for institutional arrangements that benefit girls and women. And you can see this, for example, in health funding, in the underperformance of boys in education, and a number of other areas, including appointments to organisations and organisations changing their mission statement to embrace women's empowerment, and in some cases, completely new agencies being established, like the Workplace Gender Equality Agency in recent years. So I'd be fascinated to hear you talk about what you see as the solutions, and also more than happy for you to engage with the content of the book and provide your alternative perspectives.
Yeah, thanks, David, and congratulations on your book. I think you've been very thorough. It's provocative, but it's not meant to be provocative. You're simply outlining an era whereby women have, in the first instance, gained equal rights, and then perhaps moved beyond that, whereby they want to reframe the whole world as if they own it. And the parallel in my little area of Aboriginal affairs is similar. There's this movement that is in a similar period, really, up to the 1970s, where a so-called minority group wants equality. They gain that equality, and then the next generation is not happy with equality. They want something special. So they want special arrangements for, in my case, Aborigines, in your case, women, our cases being the areas that we're most interested in. So I was just reflecting on this earlier in the day, and I thought a good example is, for instance, that we used to have actors and actresses, right? We now have actors. So we took the gender out of a lot of our language, but it's now been reintroduced by various groups who say at the bottom of their signature block, they identify as, she, her, or them, or whatever. This is the trans group. And I think, hang on, there was a point where we took gender out because we were meant to be seen as a human being, and now it's being put back in and literally thrown in our face. That is, if we don't play the gender game, or its last sort of iteration, the transgender game, then we're not seen to be good people. So, yeah, I think the longer message to me is there has been a revolution, in this case, the women's movement, which has been well and truly won, but having gained equality, that group, or some women, have now seen their opportunity to gain power. And it's really this display of power. Now, that doesn't solve the problem, if you like, that, for instance, boys are clearly not doing as well as girls at school and university. But I think that's many men and boys, I think, are not coping with the fact that the revolution occurred and they don't understand their place in it. So there's that element. And then there's the second element that I've just talked about, which is the pendulum has swung too far. Girls are now being constantly reinforced as being special, and the boys are feeling left out. So I think that's a long-winded answer, I know, but there are two elements operating there. That the expectations on men have changed, and I think that's proper and good. Boys, you've got to do domestic work as well as other work. Women are now in the formal workforce. They don't have to do domestic work and be in the formal workforce, just to provide that illustration. But in addition, yes, you're quite right. There are all sorts of mainly government organisations that get paid to look for differences when the whole revolution was to wipe out differences. And that's the irksome bit to me.
So given that situation that we're in, where there's a very lopsided institutional architecture, some of the statute-based agencies of federal governments and state governments essentially locked in for a very long period of time. Funding in a number of portfolios is quite lopsided, both for service delivery and research and other areas, capacity building. You see this in suicide, where in some of the funding streams and programs, the majority of beneficiaries are female, whereas 76.5% of suicides in Australia are male. How do you see a possibility for a healthy rebalance from a situation of seemingly institutional rigidity?
Yeah, well, the wrong answer would be to set up institutions for men. So I remember some years ago we had an Attorney General at, again, I'll go back to my little area, where there were Aboriginal legal aid. Well, there was an Aboriginal legal aid group. And that Attorney General wanted to establish a women's Aboriginal legal aid group. And I said, no, we're not going to do that. Some years on, we now have this large number of government organisations, semi-government organisations for women. We have discrimination acts, which were meant to be temporary, but they've become now mainstream and permanent. So my strategy, or the strategy that I suggest to you, is that we must now close down all of those institutions and remove those acts which were meant to give succor to, a so-called minority or oppressed group. There aren't any anymore. There are no barriers for women to succeed. So we should remove all governmental barriers. The last barrier, though, if you like, and the one we will discuss, I'm sure, is the relationship between men and women. That has changed, and that's a more difficult conversation, I suspect. And that's the one where I think your work and my interest truly lies. That is in getting people to talk to each other again, but in a new situation of equality. Some men can't handle it, and some men and boys are not being helped at all by government institutions and laws that keep emphasising women as special. So the strategy must be to tear down and remove these sort of special institutions and laws, and then at the same time, probably through, let's call them community groups. I think the churches would be a very important institution here, where we get men and women, girls and boys, to talk to each other again.
Well, that's a key part of my book in terms of healing and achieving socially healthier outcomes and better quality relationships. It's about buttressing the centre and bringing sensible men and sensible women together to talk openly and take some of the heat out of those conversations, to have a safer space to accept all perspectives. I suspect that the dismantling of some of those institutions will be hardly fought over. and very challenging in practice to achieve because of the vested interests and the livelihoods, the personal reputations, the funding streams that are on the line. So I guess that's something to ruminate about how to approach that in a respectful way that preserves dignity for all people. But one thing I wanted to mention in response to your comments, what I see with dads is hugely leaning in terms of caring for children, nurturing, being involved in school and activities and sport and the whole range. There's certainly been a dramatic change in parenting relations in the last two generations. The other thing I see with younger men is a real wholeness and appreciation of masculine and feminine, and a willingness to accept those changes that you've talked about relationships being based on equality and fairness, and both parties being actively involved. I'd love to see fathers overtly and explicitly recognised for the crucial, unique role that they play in parenting for children. One thing I do want to open up with you, though, was the different cohorts. So as manufacturing declined and as the challenges in the workforce have shown that women are dominating in service-based industries and many professions now, it's not so much that the highest educated and the highest income males that are flailing or concerned about changes in relations. My perspective is that it's been the lower cohorts in terms of education, income, social disadvantage, vulnerable families, minority communities, and so on, including Indigenous, Black Americans, Indigenous Australians, and other Indigenous communities. What's your perspective on that differential impact that these tremendous social and economic reforms have had across the spectrum of men and women?
I guess it's reasonably true to say that all revolutions exist at the middle class, not the working class, because these are usually ideological, intellectual exercises. Sometimes they come out of our universities, bad ideas flow out, they get running, good ideas flow out, they get running. And it's usually a discussion among a small group of people, then picked up by those who read most, let's call them the most educated, and eventually trickles down to, if you like, the broader group. Let's call them the working class. And let's say it may or may never get to what we might call an underclass. And there is an underclass in all societies, certainly in Australia, a group of people who find it very difficult to operate in this world and remain dependent on others for their income. And of course, we should always try to help them. So we're talking about a lag effect in these revolutions of the last, 150 or more years, the women's revolution in particular. So we are seeing, and I think you're just reflecting, we're seeing at, let's call it upper middle class, fathers who are more comfortable with the status of women, and they've found their place in relationship to women having equal status. They're working it out. Not always. Plenty of cases go through the family court of, very educated people who are fighting like cat and dog about property and children. But nevertheless, they're working it out. But I think as you run down the classes, and we do have a class system, it's not an oppressive one. It usually relates to levels of competence, education. It'll take some time, I think, to work through. The important bit here, though, is that we regain the idea that people should look up to those who behave well. People should look up to those who do have good relations, men and women, husbands and wives. So we have to get that back in. I was at a remote Aboriginal school out near Kalgoorlie just weeks ago, and at a primary school, and there was just one male teacher, and the female Aboriginal principal said to me, this fella's gold. The men in primary schools are like hen's teeth, and especially in an Aboriginal setting. So we do have to get the men back and trusted again at primary school. There has been, of course, awful examples of men and some women abusing children in institutional settings. Of course, we understand that, but we must not exclude men from those places. So that's a big agenda. We have to get men interested again or not afraid uh, to re-enter, let's say, primary teaching and daycare. And that's where perhaps we do need some institutional backing, or if not backing, the institutions that are now paranoid about the place of men ought to back off. They really ought to say, not all men are somehow a risk to children. That's abusive. That's awful. So here we go. It's a cultural game, isn't it? It's a cultural discussion where we have to say, I want to be a primary teacher. I love children. I want to help educate them and care for them. So boys and men, we have to express that desire. And if you want to put it in political terms, we have to lobby. We want back in. But for goodness sake, don't set up another institution or another stream of funding. It'll just be captured by, the upper middle classes, and they'll make of it what they will, i.e. careers with good money.
So there has been some success in North America in attracting men to nursing as a profession and a career. I completely agree about teaching daycare, others in psychology, social work, especially the frontline roles where there are a large proportion of male beneficiaries or clients or patients or students. I think there's a huge benefit there. And my own son and daughter are hugely fortunate to have quite a few male teachers and other role models in their school, which I think is fantastic for them and everyone.
Mm.
Um, I do want to give you a chance to sort of wrap up and reflect on the way forward. One thing I've been talking quite a lot about in my boards and with people in conversations on the book is reframing from trauma to healing, from victimhood to agency, uh, having a forward-looking perspective, maybe even growing from the challenges and using it as material that builds you into a better person and sets you up for the next stages in your life. What are your other thoughts about moving forward and where we go from here, Gary?
Well, yeah, you're right. It's important to be positive. There is a tendency, again, among the thinking class to say that we live in a terrible world, it's oppressive, it's shocking, etc., etc. Whereas the reality is, this is a brilliant society and a wonderful country. It's very good at talking ourselves down. Um, there are good people in this country. There are good people who are managing what I'd call this women's revolution. And we have to be encouraged that I think we're basically through and on the other side, but we now have to look after those who are not managing well. And the way to do that is to look at all the good examples of those people who do have good relationships, fair, equal relationships, men and women, which is not always steady. There are ups and downs because life is a constant negotiation. Um, so I think your positive messages are very important. We're not on the downward slope, we're actually on the upward. We've come through the other side. We do have a better appreciation of differences and distinctions between men and women that make us all better. And if you can promulgate that message through yours and other forums, then we'll be the better for it.
Thank you so much for engaging in the discussion. And, the huge contribution that you've made to culture and policy over decades. I really appreciate your time, Gary.
Thanks, David. Good day. Bye bye.